Besides the economic pressure, I very much agree. It would only grow from here on, and it can be intensified as well. But it's often also pointed out that over time, the military benefit will also shift increasingly in Iran's favor. That is, simply because Iran can launch very cheap and effective drones, and it has the ability to, up the production of them. The production isn't that centralized. Apparently, it's very difficult to do anything about it. So Iran will continue to have massive access to these cheap drones, but the Americans are forced to use very expensive $1 million interceptor missiles, which they have few of. They're expensive, and even if they have money to throw at it, they don't actually have the production potential. So it seems in terms of weaponry, it will go to the disadvantage of the US over time. And we already seen something over the past 24 or 48 hours, which is Trump made this speech about the aircraft carrier. I think he said it was attacked from 17 different directions, which makes me want to question some of the official story that they had fire in the kitchen. That's why it had to be taken out of operation. I mean, this is not what the Trump was communicating, but we also saw over the past, 24, 48 hours, the destruction of the E-3 Sentry AWACS, that is the flying radars of the United States, which are indispensable on the battlefield, and they don't have that many of them, at least no one to lose. So one of these were destroyed at a US base in Saudi Arabia. Also a few more of those KC-135 aerial tankers, which are also important to refuel any fighter planes or bombers, because they have to keep a safe distance to Iran. So how do you interpret this, though, on the battlefield? Do you see the US becoming more vulnerable, what do you expect to see in the weeks to come? Because this, essentially especially the Sentry AWACS, this is a very painful loss for the United States.
Oh, indeed, especially since they've lost all their radar systems on the ground. They're much more reliant on radar systems from the air. I think really the key issue here, Glenn, is that the Americans and the West, they've miscalculated Iran's missile and drone capabilities, obviously, very badly. But if they enter the battlefield on the ground, they don't seem to recognize that Iran's defenses will be deployed using weapons that have nothing to do with these missiles and drones that are being used. In other words, in addition to those missiles and drones that will be focusing on targeting Americans, there will be a host of other weapon systems and military units that will be targeting the United States with all sorts of other missiles that will target their helicopters, that will target their commandos, that will on the battlefield. And Iran has all sorts of underground bases across the region and in these mountain ranges and near the mountain ranges and near the shore that the Americans know nothing about. A lot of the underground bases that fire missiles, the long-range missiles and medium-range missiles, they still haven't even been used. They still haven't started operation. Most of Iran's strikes on the Israeli regime and Americans in the Persian Gulf are from a certain group of underground bases. So just as these missiles and drones that are being used exist in many other places that have yet to be, let's say, brought into yet to become operational, the Iranians have planned, and they have an elaborate plan for dealing with the ground offensive. And this is not something that they've been thinking about for the last few months. This is something that they've been planning for the last 25 years. So when they come in, who knows what sort of weapons the Iranians have to target the invaders. And of course, you are going to only mobilize Iranians against the invaders. And then, Glenn, and again, this is just hypothetical, but I think it's a serious argument. What if Iraqi forces, while the Americans are trying to invade Iranian territory, Iraqi forces and Iranian forces go into Kuwait and northern Saudi Arabia. What if Yemen enters Saudi Arabia from the southwest? Then what do the Americans do? So are the Americans going to be able to block Iran? They can also be surrounded by Iran, because if Iran moves into Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, that will destabilize these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region very swiftly. And then who's going to where the Americans going to retreat to? I mean, it's just a crazy project. Even if the Americans bring in tens of thousands of military to invade Iran, when they invaded Iraq, they had, I think, the second time when they took the country, Iraq was broken. The regime was unpopular, and the Americans had to, what was it, like 200,000 troops, 160, 70, 80,000 troops. And they brought in, their heavy tanks and also they brought in everything into the region. And they were using Saudi Arabia and Albany. Actually, the only country in the region that actively opposed the U.S. intervention in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, was Iran. Hezbollah, the chief of Hezbollah, spoke in Arabic multiple times against the war, because they said, we want freedom from this guy, from Saddam. But he was saying that the U.S., whatever Saddam may be, the U.S. has no legitimate right to invade. So these countries were all assisting the U.S. in invading Iraq back then. Iran is much larger than Iraq. Iran has shown how capable it is. And Iran's territory is mountainous. Iraq was flatland. There's just no comparison. So the United States, with a few 10,000 forces, will not be able to do anything. But again, the Iranians they can outflank them. They can, the Iranians and the Iraqis and the Yemenis can enter the Arabian Peninsula. So if things get really bad, if escalation goes up, you can envisage all sorts of things that people never thought about before. But I think they're all quite possible now.
Well, how do you assess the resilience on the Iranian side? That is, many American commentators especially say that Iran's resilience will diminish as they killed a lot of their leaders. They hit a lot of the economic targets. They bombed the civilians to have social problems. What would you say to them? And also, if these ground troops are used against the Yemen, they're in a more exposed situation, it seems, geographically than the Iranians. But still, on the map, they look very tiny and small, but their population would be about 34 million. I think in Saudi Arabia, they only have about 24. So while it looks very big, it's a lot of desert. And, I think like 35-40% of its population are expats. So it's, what would be your response to them, suggesting that Yemen would be a vulnerable target and Iran wouldn't have the same resilience anymore?
Well, Yemen obviously won its war against the United States. It won the 7-year genocidal war. Now it's much more prepared, and the United States can't focus on Yemen because it has Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran to deal with simultaneously. And Saudi Arabia, they don't fight their own wars. They basically have others do it for them. And now they just don't have the sort of capability that they had before. And Yemen could strike their oil installations and create chaos in the country and then move in. They're much tougher than the Saudis, and they've shown their resilience. In the case of Iran, Glenn, and one thing that's true about Yemen, Iran, and Iraq, and that goes back to Islam and Shia Islam in particular. General Soleimani had a very famous speech where he said, "We're the nation of martyrdom." When he was threatening Trump. He was saying, don't threaten us. In a speech, he told Trump not to threaten us. We are the nation of martyrdom. We're the nation of Imam Hussein. This is, and Imam Hussein is the grandson of the Holy Prophet. Its resilience in Iran has a lot to do with Iran's Islamic and Shia identity in particular. This resilience, this resistance comes from there, and that is true about Hezbollah. That's true about Yemen. Just a while back, a Brazilian leftist friend of mine, he was speaking to me, and a journalist, and he was saying that a very famous Brazilian communist was saying, if Iran wins this war, I'm going to become a Shia. So, but whether he does or not is irrelevant. But the point is that it just shows that how people across the world are in awe at the resilience of the Iranian people. They were supposed to fold a long time ago. I mean, the leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was martyred, and for a week we didn't have a leader. For a full week, I mean, the country was being run in accordance with the constitution, where the president and the head of the judiciary and a representative from the Guardian Council were leading. But that's not ordinary. So during that week, it was basically the people that were holding the country together. They were on the streets every night in the millions. Things were calm, and the armed forces were striking back. Things were working sort of like a watch on its own. And now we have a leader. We have a new head of the chair of the Supreme National Security Council. Everything is in place like in the past, and they've largely failed in their assassinations. But even if they do murder people, they'll be replaced. So even it's been a month and still people are out on the streets every night. Actually, last night I had to go to a studio very far away from where I live, and a very far away studio, not like where I am now. And I literally crossed Tehran, and I went past 4 or 5 of these huge gatherings in different parts of Tehran to get to that studio. The point is that people are resilient, and we had heavy bombing last night, carpet bombing, and early this morning, and people were out. When I came back from the studio, it was like 1:30 a.m. People were on the streets, waving flags and chanting slogans and listening to like revolutionary music and singing with it, or that sort of thing. No, it's not going to have. The Iranians are prepared. They understand that this is a war for survival. This is an existential war. They see that we're the victim. They saw that Ayatollah Khamenei was right after all these years, that the United States is just simply untrustworthy. They saw how the collective West antagonizes Iran, even those who are opposed to Trump. So they'll demonize Iran and antagonize Iran, whether it's CNN or the Guardian, or whether it's sort of semi-alternative media people like Mehdi Hassan and others, that they're extremely hostile towards Iran, but they'll criticize the U.S. government. They see that the Epstein class, the oligarchy, the dominant narrative is basically the narrative that the Zionists want. And so the only way is to have self-reliance and not to pin any hopes on the Democrats or the Labour Party in the UK or the Greens somewhere, or doesn't make a difference. So people here recognize that. And what, again, the West fails to understand, because they believe their own propaganda. And you've been to Iran, so you know this. Iranians know exactly what's going on. They watch Western media. And remember, some are fluent in foreign languages. They can watch satellite TV and see what the West is saying. But those who are not fluent, they watch the hundreds of Persian language media channels that are funded by Western governments, beamed into Iran, and are all full of hate and disinformation. So they know what the other side is saying. It's not as if it's a closed society. But despite that, they're on the streets. Despite that, when we didn't have a leader for a full week, everything was calm. You can walk on the streets of Tehran right now at a woman alone at 12 p.m., at 1 a.m., and feel pretty secure. I'm not saying there's no chance of, robbery, but you can feel pretty secure. So that analysis is based upon their own propaganda model, information that comes from their propaganda model, from their narratives, just like Iran's military capabilities, just like Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is the best example of all. We were told that after the fall of Syria and U.S. control of Syria, we have U.S. soldiers in Damascus and in Damascus hotels as we speak, you and I right now. Although apparently they're emptying those hotels because Iran threatened to strike those hotels. The Four Seasons and Marriott, I think. But after the United States controlled Syria and through its Takfiri proxies, and after the ceasefire in Lebanon and the Lebanese government under U.S. pressure working against the resistance, everyone in the West and many people in the region were saying that Hezbollah is finished. But now Hezbollah is performing even better than it was before the ceasefire. So these are things that the West simply cannot learn, and they're going to have to again deal with it. I have no doubt that when they invade Iran, there's going to be propaganda from CNN, from it. They'll be saying we're winning, we took this, we took that, we destroyed this place and we destroyed that, and they'll put out footage that most of the footage that they put out, these are decoys. Right now, most of the planes that they were supposedly bombed, these are decoys that Iran has purchased from China. During the last 8-9 months before the war, Iran purchased hundreds of thousands of decoys from China. Or I don't know if it's hundreds, or a huge number of decoys for launchers. And the decoys are very, very good. They even give heat, and so the Americans have no idea what they're dealing with. The Western media for 2 or 3 days will say how successful they are. But I think after a week or so, just like the war itself, it'll become clear that this was all a miscalculation.
I guess this goes back to my initial point that this is a key problem when this tendency to not just exaggerate the threat, but also exaggerate the weakness of adversaries, because one often ends up then with the conclusion that, something has to be done because they're an overwhelming threat, but there's also weak. If we just have the will to push a bit, then the whole house of cards will fall apart. And the problem is when it doesn't happen, then you end up in chaos. And just to draw the parallel with the Chinese, when the semiconductor industry didn't collapse after, when the tech industries didn't collapse after removing the access to semiconductors, once Russia didn't collapse, by sending weapons and putting the sanctions on, or Iran, one is left in this strategic vacuum, because this was essentially the only card to play. That is, show enough power and adversaries will fall apart. So, and always that goes with all the small to medium-sized countries bombed over the past 30 years as well. When there's no exit strategy, it's shocking that one keeps doing the same thing over and over again. But again, absorbing this mistake, that is the attack on Iran, this is something I don't see how one can recover from this, because this is the closure of Hormuz. I just don't see an end to this war. I guess do you see any other possibilities than the U.S. obeying, I guess, Iranian demands, or is there a meeting point somewhere halfway?
Well, Iranian demands will have to be met. How they're met, like how they would be negotiated, that's a different issue. Some things the U.S. could walk away from and say, we had nothing to do with this. For example, Iran will demand reparations. And the U.S. will say, I'll never give them reparations. Well, Iran can take it from Emirates and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris. So that won't be a U.S. problem. the United States, Iran will not allow, Iran will not allow the United States to be able to use the Persian Gulf region as a platform to invade Iran or strike Iran. The United States could say, well, we won't accept, but in reality, Iran can force those countries in the Persian Gulf not to allow the United States to have the access that it had before. So the United States could say, no, I'm still there and I'm going to remain there. I mean, Iran doesn't have a problem with these countries having political relations or business relations with the United States. The issue is being a platform for murdering Iranians and destroying Iranian assets and infrastructure. So there are things that can be solved without, the United States having to be humiliated. But there are things that there are red lines. There are things that Iran has to do. For example, Iran's allies in the region will be a part of the deal. There's no doubt that, and Iran has declared that, Hezbollah will have to benefit from it. Yemen will have to benefit from it. The Palestinians will have to benefit from it. The Iraqis will have to benefit from it. So, there are certain things that will happen whether the Americans like it or not, because if they don't, Iran is basically inviting another invasion 6 months or a year and a half down the road. That has to end. So we have no option. But I think this war, the real issue is not how many children they slaughtered. Last night, they killed a lot of people in Tehran, and they just bombed houses. I mean, last night was, the last 2-3 nights, they've been particularly vicious. And last night, not just in Tehran and elsewhere, they're just bombing homes and killing people, like in Lebanon and Gaza. It's a type of, they're trying to create fear, I guess, and they are frustrated that they can't defeat Iran. But last night, for example, they murdered an Afghan family of 6 in Ray to the southeast of Tehran. They're just slaughtering people. But all of this is, at the moment, is costly, and it's putting a strain on the military and their resources. But that, I think, is the sideshow. And Iran can destroy U.S. assets. But the real issue is the oil, the LNG, and the petrochemicals, and the fertilizer. That is where the United States is in serious trouble. And so if the prices go through the roof, and the situation, and if Yemen also strikes Saudi installations, then I don't think the war is sustainable anymore. The United States will have to, because there will be an economic depression, and I think there will be severe unrest in the United States. And I also think the United States won't have the money to sustain war. But the Iranians recognize that. And that is what their objective, to increase the pressure to a point where the Americans say, okay, let's find a solution that is satisfactory to the Iranians. And again, it can be negotiated in a way where the Americans would accept, in my opinion. And again, this reminds me of the book Going to Tehran, which I advise your viewers to read, by Flint and Hillier Leverett. The Americans could have had a very different type of relationship with Iran. They explain Iran's history, and they deal with many of the myths about Iran, the demonization of Iran. It could have been completely different. But now the United States is in a situation that it's only going to get worse for everyone. And bombing Iran in the hope that people in Iran will submit, it hasn't worked before, and it's not going to work now. And time is not, this is what the Iranians understand very well. Time is not on their side. Time is on the side of the Iranians. Because every minute, the shortage of energy and petrochemicals and fertilizers grows. It's, every day it's going to get, next week, the markets, I would assume, will begin to reflect this, and then the week after. And I think after, different people say different things, but within 3 weeks from now, they say the situation is going to be very critical. And even in a week from now, they say it's going to get pretty bad. And we have to keep in mind that the ships that take oil and fertilizer and energy and petrochemicals, a lot of them take weeks to get to their destination, and then for for everything to be taken to the market, it takes a further a couple of weeks. It's just now going to hit. People are talking about some shortages here and there, and the price is rising. But pretty soon it's going to get very bad. And the Iranians know that. The Iranians don't want this. They didn't start the war. But the only way to stop the Americans is to increase the pressure so that they back down. And I think pretty soon that pressure is going to be felt in a very big way.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and stay safe.
Thank you, Glenn. It's always a pleasure being with you. And I hope and pray for better days for everyone. And I know people across the world so many people contact me, and they say they're praying for the Iranians. I know communists. I have communist friends who say they're praying. So the world is indeed changing, and views are evolving. And although, again, as I've said many times before, I am very optimistic about the future, even though I may not live to see that day. And while the days ahead may be darker and darker, but I think that ultimately, I'm confident that ultimately it will be better than